Hello, my name's Jeff Messier. I'm a professor in electrical and software engineering in the Schulich School of Engineering. And the title of this presentation is Using AI to Improve Homelessness Services. And this is a talk I've been invited to give at the 2024 FIANSA conference. And FIANSA is the Federation of National Agencies to Prevent Homelessness in Europe. And so this is going to be the first time I'm presenting to an international audience on this topic. So I'm really excited about that. And in many ways, this is kind of an update of a talk that I gave a couple years ago at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference, the National Canadian Conference. And, AI is moving fast. And so I'm going to be picking up on some of the themes from that previous presentation, but I'm going to be updating things as well. Now, first of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of the partner organizations that I have in Calgary. And this work I'm going to be talking about some of the case studies of work that we've done with data, and that work is only possible thanks to partnerships with these organizations. So, as with all my talks, I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. But because this is a European conference, I wanted to add a little bit more context around land acknowledgements because I'm not sure if it's going to be familiar to necessarily everyone in the audience. And so I thought I would start by talking a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was launched in 2008 in partial response to the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, which was actually the biggest class action lawsuit in Canadian history at the time, and I think still is. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission delivered a final report in 2015 that included 94 calls to action. And the QR code I've got here is a link to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and so really this story is more appropriately told by the Indigenous voices that are part of that National Center and other organizations as well. But the context specific for this talk is that it's now accepted practice in Canada to perform a land acknowledgement at the start of presentations, just to acknowledge the people who were here before European settlers. And the land acknowledgement that I'm doing is specific to Calgary. So I'm fortunate to make my home in Calgary, which is the traditional lands of the Treaty 7 people, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, composed of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Stoney Nakoda people include the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Good Stoney First Nations. As well, these lands are home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 5 and 6. So I've got several objectives for this talk. The first one is basically to define exactly what we mean by artificial intelligence. AI is something that is very much in the sort of the public lexicon now, but I think it's important to start from kind of some common definitions and understandings. I want to provide the audience with some hopefully reasonably simple rules for when AI may or may not be useful in a housing and homelessness context. I want to present some example cases where AI has had value and in that domain, and then finally conclude with some things to keep in mind when thinking about how to ethically use AI in housing and homelessness specifically, but probably these rules are probably a good idea for everybody to keep in mind regardless of domain. And so what is artificial intelligence, AI, machine learning? Basically, it's a computer program, right? And a computer program specifically that can learn from past data. And what that means is that we say an AI tool is trained by exposing the tool to patterns in past data, and the computer program basically looks at these patterns and comes up with a more efficient representation of the patterns as part of its sort of internal structure. And AI tools can be used for, we can kind of break AI tools down into sort of two categories, right? Like the first category is AI tools that can predict if something will happen based on patterns in data. So you train up the AI tool using patterns in some sort of historical data set, and then you give it new data. And if the AI tool sees similar patterns that it saw in the historical data, it'll say, oh, this particular outcome might be happening again. The second sort of category of AI tools are tools that we refer to as generative AI. And of course, ChatGPT is sort of the most famous example of generative AI. And these tools create data, or they create content. So, but they work in a very similar way. So you train them on past data sets in the terms of, or in the case of ChatGPT, ChatGPT was trained on the internet, basically, data scraped from the internet. And then using the patterns in that past data, the AI tool can create new data that fits the patterns in the old data. So if you ask ChatGPT to write you an essay on, let's say, Karl Marx, the ChatGPT basically just looks at all of the other things it's read about Karl Marx and then takes those patterns and uses those to create an essay. So, a simple example is image recognition, which is kind of a classic AI example. And so if you wanted a tool that was an expert on images of dogs, you would expose the tool to a whole bunch of images. And some of those images would be labeled as dogs, and the ones that were not dogs would be labeled as not dogs. And then you can use the AI tool in basically the two ways I outlined above. You could expose the AI tool to a new image and say, is this a dog? And the tool would make a decision, yes it is, or no it isn't. Or if you had a more generative tool, you could ask the tool to produce new images that looked like dogs. So as promised, I wanted to provide some sort of simple rules of thumb for when and how AI should be used for housing and homelessness. And I call these Jeff's Golden Rules of AI and Homelessness. And I put my name on it, not because, I want to spread my brand or become famous or anything, but I want to make it clear that these are my opinion. And so AI is a very active field, and there are a lot of experts out there working on it. Then some of those experts may well have very different opinions than I do. So this is just my disclaimer. These are my opinions based on my experience working in the housing and homelessness sector with various, data applications. And so my rules are as follows. First of all, the first golden rule is that humans are great and you should not replace them with AI. Second rule is that before you consider AI, you must have a well-functioning data IT system. That has to come first. The third rule is, just like people, if you want to use AI in housing and homelessness, that AI should specialize in housing and homelessness. So if you're delivering a program with a human being, you don't just grab a random person off the street to do that job. You want somebody who has been trained in maybe social work, for example, and has some sort of expert background in the field. And finally, in many ways, just like humans, AI can't do everything well. And so it's really important, if you're thinking about using AI, to use it for a job that it's good at. And so these 4 golden rules are just going to provide structure to the rest of my talk, and I'm going to expand on each one of these points. Okay, so rule number 1, humans are great, do not replace them with AI. So the reason why I say this is, what I've observed, my experience, and hopefully this resonates with many of you working in the sector as well, is that making a human connection, a human-to-human connection with a person experiencing homelessness is essential to helping them into not just a home, but just into a better place where they can start to heal from, all the different challenges that they might be facing. And sometimes humans are all you need. And as an example, in the province of Alberta in Canada, there's a city called Medicine Hat. And it's a small city. I think now it's probably got about 70 or 80,000 people. And very famously, they became the first city in Canada to eliminate homelessness, or specifically eliminate chronic homelessness. And I sat in a presentation from the director of homelessness services from Medicine Hat, and she described how they did it. And basically, at that time, they had some number of chronically homeless people. I forget how many it was. I think it was kind of around 100 or maybe a little less than 100. And they had the staff resources to basically talk to every single one of those chronically homeless people. They had several meetings with each one of them. They got to know them. They got to know their goals and their hopes and their challenges. And with that human to human contact, they were able to move those people out of homelessness into some sort of supportive living situation. And that's how they did it. So there was no AI, there was no data. There was just a whole bunch of very, intentional, caring people making contact with other people. And if you have a similar situation, forget about AI. You don't need it. So the other point I wanted to make around, data and AI and humans is, of course, again, if you're working in the sector, that working in the homelessness sector is very hard. It's challenging. It's emotionally taxing. You're dealing with, people that are experiencing very, very difficult problems. And so if we're using data and if we're considering AI, these tools should make working in the homelessness sector easier. Unfortunately, it's often opposite to the case. And there's been research done. So many of you will know this anecdotally, but there has actually been research done on this as well, where researchers have talked with people in the nonprofit sector and they have felt disempowered by data. And this is a screenshot of one of the papers on this topic. And so too often, data tools are seen by staff as just one more thing they have to do that is not necessarily helping them with their job. And so the first question you should ask yourself is not, should my organization be using AI? The first question you have to ask yourself is, can my staff easily access the information they need to effectively do their jobs? This is the first and primary question. Sometimes AI can help your staff effectively access the information that they need to do their jobs. But this isn't just an AI story. This is a story about data in general and data tools in general. And this brings me to the second golden rule, that before you consider AI, you have to have a very well functioning data IT ecosystem at your organization. Your basic sort of fundamental data systems have to be working very well before you consider building on those systems or possibly enhancing them using AI. And there are a couple of things to think about in this domain, I guess. The first thing is, ensure that the data that you are collecting is of high quality. And what I mean by that is, are your staff recording all the information that's relevant for their jobs and very closely related? Are they recording data that is not being used? Too often in the housing and homelessness sector, data collection is mandated by funding organizations. So staff have to do surveys, collect data about the people that they're working with. And they never get to use that data. They never get to see it again. It just sort of vanishes into, some system that funders happen to be using. And so, do you have data in your organization that accurately represents the people that you're trying to serve? Um, the second point is centralized data is key. In order for artificial intelligence to work, it needs to have all the data in one place. And so that means you need some sort of central server, central database that's collecting all of the information from your organization. You can't have, for example, like information spread out over many spreadsheets or Microsoft Word documents or written logbooks, for example. All data has to be in one spot. And finally, the third and really the most important point, and it gets back to my previous slide, your data systems must be user friendly. Remember, the overall objective in all of this, AI and data in general, is just to make it easier for your staff to do their jobs. And this starts and it's possible AI might help your staff make it easier to do their jobs, but first of all, you have to take care of your basic data systems. How easy is it for your staff to enter the data into the system? Can they access, once they enter data into the system, can they get it back? Can they pull data out of the system that helps them do their jobs? And, do your data systems save time or do they consume time? If you completely took your data system away, would your staff all of a sudden, would it take longer for them to do their jobs, or would they have like a bunch of extra time in their day that they could then use for something else, right? These are really, really important questions, and it's not trivial. So this, having data systems that can support your staff and possibly also support enhancement by AI is a big investment. And I've seen some not-for-profits with data systems that are of this quality, but I've seen many that aren't. And so this is absolutely the first step. The third golden rule is, if you're considering about using AI, make sure that your AI is a specialist in housing and homelessness. And this rule is directly sort of aimed at ChatGPT. And so, in this audience, many of you, probably most of you, are already using AI. And by AI, I mean ChatGPT. I talk to lots of people in at housing and homelessness agencies, and they use ChatGPT a lot, particularly for writing proposals, writing reports. And I've used it in the same way. Although I'll say nothing in this nothing in this presentation was generated by ChatGPT, but sometimes you're writing a paragraph and you're having trouble with the wording, and ChatGPT can help you with that. And so it's really amazing what you can ask ChatGPT to do. And so kind of the looming question is, hey, I've got a kind of a complicated case that I'm working on. I have a person who's experienced all kinds of different challenges, and I have a description. I have their data. Can I just cut and paste that data into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT what we should do with this person? Maybe ChatGPT could recommend, if this person should be placed in a certain type of housing program or be connected to certain types of supports. And you know what? If you cut and pasted something like that into ChatGPT, I've not tried this, but it would probably generate some kind of answer. But this is a terrible idea. And maybe intuitively, many of you also know that would be a terrible idea, but let's talk specifically why this is a terrible idea. First of all, ChatGPT is trained on the internet, right? So it was created by scraping all the data they could off the internet. And so ChatGPT has spent as much time studying housing and homelessness as the internet spends studying housing and homelessness. So there is some discussion on the internet about housing and homelessness, and that's what ChatGPT would pull from if you asked it a homelessness question. But it has read everything about housing and homelessness, including, people's, opinions about homelessness on social media, for example, blog posting on social media. So if there's somebody with a blog that says, everyone experiencing homelessness should be put in jail, ChatGPT just takes that information and includes it in its kind of body of knowledge. And so if you ask ChatGPT about homelessness, it's kind of not exactly, but sort of roughly equivalent to just, grabbing a random person off the street and asking them to make a decision about homelessness. And this random person that you've grabbed off the street has learned everything just from reading the internet. And so you wouldn't do that, right? Like if you were recruiting a person to work in your homelessness agency, you would try to find a specialist. You would try to find somebody who has maybe been through a counseling program or a social work program with or with some experience working in the sector already. Somebody who has specialized and has spent time getting to know the homelessness sector in particular. And AI is exactly the same. So these general purpose AI tools are not a good choice for housing and homelessness. If you want to use AI, you should take data specifically from the sector and from the people that you're interested in and create your own AI based on that data. The other, thing to remember about ChatGPT is that it's not running on your computer. So when you cut and paste something into ChatGPT, that data is sent to the OpenAI servers in the United States, and then ChatGPT runs on those servers and produces the answer. So every time you cut and paste something into ChatGPT, you're sending it to the United States to be processed by a for-profit company before you get your answer back. And the notion of data governance, data sovereignty is a big deal. So you can't necessarily just send, data, confidential data across, international borders necessarily. I think most people are aware of this, but it just bears saying. Okay, and now finally for the fourth golden rule, if you're considering AI, make sure you use AI for a problem that it's well suited for. And so this can be kind of challenging, right? Understanding what AI is or isn't good for. And so I'm going to spend, a fair bit of time in this presentation talking about this. And so, when you're thinking about whether or not something is a good fit for AI, you could ask your things like, does your agency see a very high volume of people? Do you see a lot of people coming through your agency? If you only have a few people going through your agency and you can get to know them, you have a medicine hat type situation, right? Where you can just form relationships with each one of your people, and you don't necessarily need AI to help with that. Do you experience high staff turnover? So it doesn't matter if your staff are forming relationships to people, but if the staff aren't there for very long, you always have staff that are kind of unfamiliar with the people being served by your agency. And that is a case where you might, rely a little bit more on using data rather than sort of human knowledge. Is it difficult to summarize a person's data? Like, do you have a lot of stuff written down for a person, but is it kind of hard to sort of summarize it in an easy to digest way? If that's the case, AI tools might be helpful. And the final question is, do you spend a lot of time merging and cleaning data? Just sort of like very repetitive tasks, checking data for errors, maybe, connecting records together and stuff like that. That kind of like repetitive sort of, same task over and over again also is potentially a good candidate for AI. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to present two case studies. It's sort of work that I've been involved with, or I'm currently doing. The first one is a case study where we've used machine learning to assess someone's risk of chronic shelter use or becoming a long-time shelter user. And this case study sort of hits the first three questions, right? So this first case study was a good use of AI in a situation where there was a high volume of people. There was potentially a lot of staff turnover because it was a very high volume shelter. And, the data, it wasn't necessarily easy to access and summarize a person's data. The second case study is related to linking shelter data. And this is an example where AI is not necessarily used in the front lines, but it's sort of used behind the scenes to improve your data and make it a little bit more useful. So in this first case study, we make use of AI not to replace the frontline decision maker. That would be, in violation of the first golden rule. But we use it in such a way as to help support the frontline decision maker by giving them a little bit more information or a little bit more context to help make their decision. And for this first case study, I would draw sort of a parallel between a caseworker in a homelessness shelter and a medical physician, like a doctor. So both caseworkers and physicians make decisions in a similar way, actually, when you think about it. So, if you go into your doctor's office, your doctor will ask you about your history. How have you been feeling? If you're feeling well, when did you start feeling unwell? What's going on in your life, perhaps? And they also assess kind of my current condition. So if I go into my doctor's office, I could, I'll describe how I'm feeling, but then there's a series of tests, medical measurements that a physician can make on me that helps them make a decision. So for example, they could take a blood sample or they could take my blood pressure, and something like a blood pressure measurement does not make a decision. So a blood pressure reading is not going to tell the doctor, do this or do that, but it provides additional information that helps the physician make their decision. And the one difference between homelessness and the medical domain is that people working in the homelessness sector they don't really have these measurements that they can do that help with their decision making. And so the question is, could we use machine learning to make sort of the equivalent of a blood pressure test? And what do I mean by that? Well, could we use machine learning to estimate whether or not a client is at risk of, a particular sort of adverse outcome, right? So we're not making a decision here, but we are estimating whether or not someone is at risk or at elevated risk of a particular outcome. And this is kind of what a blood pressure measurement does. If I've got high blood pressure, that puts me at elevated risk of certain things, and my doctor can sort of take that into account. And so what we decided to do is see if we could use machine learning to determine someone's risk of becoming a long-term or quote unquote chronic shelter user. And this was work that we did in collaboration with a shelter in Calgary called the Drop-In Center. And, at the time we did this work, the Drop-In Center was seeing about 268 new clients per month. So it was a fairly high traffic shelter. And what we observed, and this is pretty consistent across the literature, is that, the vast majority, 85%, were in shelter for a very short time. These are the so-called transitional users or temporary users, where they are in shelter for maybe a week or 2 weeks, and then they're gone, and we never see them again. So these people don't need additional help or supports. They can exit on their own. 12% are episodic users that are, occasional shelter users over a longer period of time. And a smaller percentage, in this case 3%, are long-term chronic shelter users who are in shelter every day and have trouble getting out on their own. Now, in Canada and many jurisdictions, these chronic shelter users are prioritized for housing supports. Now, in many jurisdictions, we follow housing first strategies that prioritize, chronic clients for housing supports, right? We want to connect these long-term shelter users to the supports they need to exit shelter. But how do we know who is a long-time shelter user? Well, I mean, the obvious strategy is to wait a long time. So you can be a long-time shelter user if you're just here for a long time. But that's a terrible strategy, right? Because, if somebody shows up in shelter, we don't want to say, well, if you're still here in a year, we're going to help you, right? We want to connect people as quickly as possible to supports. So what we decided to explore instead was using machine learning to find patterns in someone's data that suggest that they are at risk of becoming a long-term shelter user. So this is kind of, the equivalent of having a high blood pressure reading. We're noticing things about a person early on in shelter that suggest they're at risk of something that we want to avoid, and then we can act sooner rather than later. And so we used a form of machine learning called rule set searching, which is an interpretable form of machine learning, and it basically allows us to develop a machine learning model that can be expressed in sort of human understandable language. And so our algorithm ended up suggesting that, we can take someone's first 60 days of shelter data. And if that person is in shelter for more than 54 of those 60 days and has engaged with like counselor supports less than 11 times, they are at, significantly increased risk of becoming a chronic shelter user. And so this tool is good for a couple of reasons. First of all, it allows us to spot at-risk people after only 60 days rather than having to wait a year, which is sort of the normal length of time to define chronic homelessness. It's intuitive, right? So the tool is basically telling us if somebody is in shelter very consistently, but they are not accessing support services, then they're at increased risk. So it makes intuitive sense. And then the other nice thing about this machine learning tool is you don't need fancy IT equipment to implement it. This is just a standard sort of search thing that you can do in a regular database. So again, an example of using machine learning not to make a decision, but to spot somebody who is at increased risk that might benefit from being connected to a counselor for additional discussions about supports. So the second case study is an example of when machine learning can be used not in a frontline setting, but sort of behind the scenes to help improve data and learn something from sort of a program analysis level rather than a frontline decision-making perspective. And so in this case study, what we did was we used machine learning to link records from the youth homelessness system of care in Calgary to the adult homelessness system of care. And so we worked with two agencies. The first one, Trellis Society, is a youth serving agency, and they provided data that had about 21,000 client profiles spread across 75 different programs. We also had data from the Calgary Homeless Foundation, which serves the adult system of care. And they had data for 264,000 different profiles spread across 150 different programs. Now, it's important to point out that these profiles don't all represent one individual person. In fact, many profiles refer to the same person. So if the same person accesses multiple services, they're going to have a profile at each one of those services. And so the purpose of this project was to link all those profiles together specifically to understand how young people make the transition from the youth system of care to the adult system of care. Now, linking profiles in the homelessness sector is a little challenging because, at least in Canada, we don't give people a unique identification number. And so we have to compare these profiles. We have to link these profiles using names and birth dates. And this is possible, but there's a couple of challenges. And the first challenge is the huge number of comparisons that we have to make. So we have, roughly 280,000 profiles, and each profile needs to be compared with every other profile to see if they refer to the same person. And so if you do the calculation, this is over 40 billion comparisons. And obviously, this is not something that you're going to be doing by hand, but this is a perfect job for a computer. So this is an example of where we used machine learning to do all of these linkages, and we were able to do it. I was able to do it on just kind of like a regular PC in my office in about 6 hours. And so, talking about this a little bit more specifically, there's a couple of challenges, right, when you're linking with names and birth dates. And the first challenge is, there's going to be some variation in how these names are spelled. And my name is a great example. So my name is Jeffrey, and it's spelled Geoffrey. Often I'm referred to as Jeff rather than Jeffrey. It's kind of only my mom really calls me Jeffrey. But in Canada, anyways, it's much more common to spell Jeff with a J rather than Jeff with a G. So people are constantly spelling my name with a J, and sometimes I correct them, sometimes I don't. And so if I'm accessing multiple programs, the chances are high that my name might be spelled with a G in one place and a J in another place. And so when we're linking records together, we have to be able to link names and birth dates that are similar but not identical. And computers can do this by calculating something called a similarity metric, or an edit distance. And an edit distance basically just counts the number of characters that are different between two words. And so Jeff with a G, Jeff with a J would have a distance of 1 because there's one character different. Jeff with a G versus Jeffrey with a J would have an edit distance of 5 because we changed a character, we deleted a character, and we added 3 new ones. And so machine learning is a really good tool for using these similarity metrics to spot and link names that are similar but not identical. And that's what we did with this project. And the other big thing to think about when doing this kind of linkage is preserving the privacy of the people in the data. And so we were able to use a technique called Bloom filtering, which is kind of a scrambling or an encryption technique that allows us to scramble the names so they can't be read, but it still allows us to calculate these sort of similarity metrics. And when we did that, we took, we did our 40 billion comparisons, and these were the results. So we found that the 20,000 or 21,000 profiles in the Trellis data corresponded to 18,000 actual people. The 264,000 profiles in the CHF data corresponded to just less than 100,000 people. And, it was pretty common for people to have, for the same person to have multiple records. So this kind of justifies the need to link data in the first place if you want to understand how people are accessing multiple services. And just to sort of conclude with our specific example, when we did this linkage, we found that 88% of the youth involved with Trellis did not appear in the adult system at all, which is good news, right? We don't want young people to end up in adult shelter. When we take a look at the 12% of kids who did wind up in the adult system, this is what their pathways looked like. And I'm not going to dive into the details here, other than, you can see people who accessed youth shelter flowing into adult shelter, adult case management, adult housing, and then people that were accessing shelter exiting the system from shelter or exiting the system from housing. Again, kind of a complicated diagram. I'm not going to go into the details, other than just to sort of show you how we can now start to understand the journey or the paths that people trace through multiple services when we're able to link data using machine learning. So whenever using artificial intelligence to, you know, assist with services provided to humans, it's important to think about and to discuss the ethics of using these tools and how best to use them to, you know, achieve a good outcome. And there's a lot of different ways of looking at the ethics around AI, but, you know, for this presentation, I decided to divide, you know, the ethics along questions around the data and questions around the technology. And so, first of all, related to the data, we've, you know, talked a lot about in this presentation about how AI tools are trained using data. You create an AI tool by giving it historical data. It learns the patterns in that data and it uses those patterns to make its decisions. And that means that the data has to be of very, very high quality. And very specifically, what I mean by high quality is that the data must do a good job of representing the people that you're trying to help. And so this point is related to the first case study I presented when we used machine learning to estimate risk of becoming a long-term shelter user. So for this study, we used data from the Calgary Drop-In Center shelter to estimate or to identify people who were at risk of becoming long-term shelter users at that particular shelter. Is it a good idea to then use my tool at a different shelter in Calgary? Is it a good idea to use those same rules at a shelter in Vienna or at a shelter in New York City? The answer is probably no, unless you verify that with local data. So it's generally speaking not a good idea to take a model that has been trained on one particular population or group of people and apply it to another one without really sort of checking, you know, the performance of that model on the data set that it's being applied to. And so if you're thinking about using an AI tool at your organization, it needs to be trained on data that really accurately represents the specific people that you are trying to help. This also goes back to what we were talking about related to ChatGPT. ChatGPT has been trained on the internet as a whole, not on your population of people that you're trying to help in particular. The second point, if you're using someone's data, are you using it, does your use of the data reflect the wishes of the people in that data? And so do you have the consent of the people in your data to use that data in a machine learning model to make decisions? This question also relates to the second case study that I presented. So in that case study, we linked data from a whole bunch of different programs together so we could see how, you know, a population of people flowed through different programs. However, those people had not provided their consent to have their actual names and birth dates shared outside of the organizations that they were using. And so because of that, we had to use the encryption technique. So we used a special protocol where the different agencies encrypted the data before giving the data to us for linkage. And we used best practices also in terms of not zooming in on one particular person linked in the data. We made sure that we only looked at sort of large sort of population trends. There's also some technology questions around the ethical use of AI. So first of all, these points come more from, you know, maybe the perspective of companies that might be trying to sell you an AI tool. So for example, I would never recommend an AI tool that was not compatible with your IT systems. Again, working in the not-for-profit sector, we don't always have the luxury of very high-end computing platforms that can run a lot of these AI tools. So don't think about AI unless it can be supported on your particular system. This point is also related to the first case study because those rules for spotting, somebody experiencing or at risk of long-term shelter use, sleeps greater than 54, counselor interactions less than 11. I generated those rules on, a fairly sophisticated computer, but those rules can be applied inside a spreadsheet or inside a very, kind of basic database. So that's an example of a machine learning tool that is accessible for, a range of IT platforms. The second point, do you have the staff expertise to understand and maintain an AI tool? Does this mean that you have to have a data scientist on staff? It doesn't necessarily, but at the same time, this can't also just sort of be a mysterious black box. If you are working with a data science, maybe consultant to produce an AI tool, that person should be able to explain to you how the model works. And if they can't, I would be very reluctant to just sort of blindly accept the model. And finally, do you have the processes and funding in place to update your tool? Remember, AI tools are created by training your tools on a historical data set, on the patterns in a historical data set. Once your training is finished, your AI tool is fixed. It's static. So to use a ChatGPT example, if a version of ChatGPT is trained on the internet up to the end of 2021, it can't tell you anything about what happened in 2022 or 2023. To use another example, imagine, training an artificial intelligence tool on, let's say homelessness data pre-COVID-19. It would be, making certain recommendations that likely didn't apply during the pandemic, just because patterns in homelessness changed so much during the pandemic. And so an AI tool is never finished. It should always be continuously updated with new data to recognize existing trends. And if your organization is not prepared to continually update and maintain your AI tool, you shouldn't consider using the AI tool. And this is, it's an expensive proposition, but I think it's one it's a very important point to make. And so to conclude, thanks very much for listening through the talk. This is a little bit of a longer one, just because the conference was good enough to give me a little bit more time to speak. And so what are the conclusions? I mean, AI can certainly be helpful, right? It can be a good tool, but it isn't necessarily for everyone. And so if you're in an agency, do not by any means feel that you're somehow, being left behind because you're not leveraging AI. Don't think that AI can, find a solution to homelessness that you haven't thought of. At best, AI is as good as a human expert in housing and homelessness, in my opinion. And it can sometimes work faster, right? So for example, it did those 40 billion record comparisons a lot faster than I could have done them by hand. But the quality of the decisions or the insight, in my opinion, are not really going to be that much different than a human expert that's familiar with the same data that you're feeding into the AI. The second point is that, make sure before you're considering AI, you invest in your people and you invest in the IT data systems that your people are using every day to both enter and access data. That is absolutely the first step, not only from the point of view of, like the AI training data needing to be high quality, but just you might find that that's all you need, right? Like maybe your human staff were spending, an hour or two a day struggling with a really difficult to use IT system. And once you streamline that a little bit, they can use that extra time to work with the people in your organization to get the outcomes that you want. And you didn't need to look at AI at all. And so thanks very much for listening to my talk. Here's a QR code to my research website. This is a place, I'm kind of constantly updating it with the things that I'm thinking about and the stuff that I'm working on. And if you are at a housing or homelessness agency and you're interested in chatting more about this, I'm very interested in having those conversations with you. And so just please reach out.